Today in this video I'm going to show you how to do a Big 3 upgrade. Now the Big 3 upgrade involves upgrading your car's electrical system. Cars have many cables and grounding points, but these are the Big 3. Now the Big 3 are alternator positive to battery positive, battery negative to chassis ground, and the engine block, which is ultimately the alternator ground, also to the chassis ground. They are the Big 3 cables in many modern vehicles. So why do a Big 3 upgrade? Well, it improves voltage stability, reduces electrical resistance, maximizes performance of your alternator, and also major components can corrode over time with the wear and tear of the car. Now, undersized, corroded or poor wiring, like this one here, increases resistance. When this happens, more stress is put on the alternator as it must work harder. This provides less consistent voltage across your electrical system. Now, most of you out there, you probably want to do a Big 3 upgrade like everyone else because you want to throw in a nice new sound system. You've upgraded your alternator capable of producing a lot more power, and you want to replicate that in your car. You want a stereo system, you want all kinds of auxiliary accessories in your car. But that is not the only reason to do a Big 3 upgrade. Upgrading the wiring in your car's electrical system can offer many advantages. Improved voltage stability, reduced electrical resistance, maximizing the performance of your alternator. It doesn't have to work so hard. Wiring and terminals can corrode over time, so doing a Big 3 even just for these reasons is quite beneficial for your car's electrical system. So whether you're doing the Big 3 upgrade for performance, maintenance or cautionary, follow along and I'll show you everything you need to know about the Big 3 upgrade. From crimping our own cables to calculating wire sizing to fusing and everything in between. This is a demo car for video demonstration purposes only. Without further ado, let's get going. Now here are some of the tools and parts we're going to need for this job here. The first thing, well, we need the wiring. We're going to be upgrading our wiring here. This is a nice thick wire right here. Don't worry, later in the video we're going to be calculating the wire size just for your alternator and everything in between. We'll need a fuse as well. More on fuses later. We're going to talk all about fuses, some sockets and various things so we can bolt it down. Some crimp terminals if you don't get a Big 3 kit especially. I don't really recommend those, and we're going to be crimping our own wiring with vacuum tubing here to make it look like this. You may need some Tessa tape and some zip ties to tidy everything away. We may need to be removing some car paint to get a good ground. We may need some dielectric grease to prevent corrosion on our terminals, and some conduit or trunking to protect our wire from potentially melting, kinking and getting shorted out, causing lots of problems, and maybe some other knickknacks as well. Okay, let's get going. Now, cables can come in a variety of different sizes, but the materials, the conductor inside, can also differ. The two main ones being copper and aluminum, or aluminium for our European friends. So a cable with a copper conductor like this one right here is more expensive, but it has a higher heat resistance, better conductivity and better corrosion resistance as well. While aluminum on the other hand is lighter and cheaper, it has a lower conductivity and is more prone to issues like oxidation and the formation of resistive oxide layers. For these very reasons, you may notice an aluminum wire is slightly thicker than its copper counterpart to cater for these things. For something like a Big 3 upgrade, the wires you're going to be replacing will be relatively short. We're not really going to be wiring a whole bus or a whole truck all the way down the length of the truck or anything like that, so cost relatively will be quite low regardless of the conductor you choose. In this video, we're going to be cutting and crimping our own cables, so it's very important to get an accurate length of how much wire we need to order. We don't want to unnecessarily order too much. It is actually quite expensive. So we need to locate the 3 points for the Big 3. The alternator to the battery to the chassis, and the alternator ground, ultimately the engine block to the chassis as well. Let's look at the first one, which is the battery negative to the chassis. If we come over to the battery here, let's try and locate the battery negative to the chassis ground. So you can see here's the battery negative. Adding a little light in there, we can see it is bolted right there where my finger is. So that is the battery negative to the chassis ground. You can see how thick the existing stock wire is here. And to contrast, let's have a look at our potential replacement. You can see it is a lot thicker and it's going to be designed for handling a lot more current. Okay, that's number one. Now don't worry if you don't have the exact same car or truck used in the video. It really doesn't matter. Almost every car out there that we're working on anyway with regards to this will have an alternator and a battery. Just use the principles I explain in a second to locate your own. Okay, so the second wire of the big three we're going to search for is the alternator ground to the chassis body. Now this is probably a good time to mention that the car is one giant grounding post. You can see the negative terminal goes to the grounding post of the car, so you can pretty much ground out using the chassis of the car, providing there's no paint or anything in the way. It gets a good solid ground. The same principle applies. The alternator here on this vehicle anyway, and most others, it's grounded through the body of the alternator into the engine block. So by connecting your engine block to the chassis ground, you're ultimately grounding your alternator. That being said, make sure you check your alternator for any special grounding points or grounding posts. On this vehicle, it's grounded through the body, so we're going to be locating something from the engine block to the body of the car. Do make sure to check around the back of the engine and underneath. On some vehicles, they're hiding right at the back there. But on this vehicle, we're actually pretty lucky. You can see here's the engine mount right here, and just underneath there's a little bolt, a tiny little wire there, and it's going to the body of the car. This is the wire we're looking at replacing here. And to contrast there, look at that difference. Wow. And while we're here, if you've ever wanted to learn how to replace a drive belt, I'll link a video in the description below. Now the third and final cable of the big three is probably perhaps the most complicated one, which is the alternator positive all the way to the battery positive right here. I say it's complicated because on this cable you should really add an inline fuse. Don't listen to anyone not telling you to do this. So to find this, we look at our alternator, we look at every single cable coming out of it, we look all the way around. It looks like there's a nice little cable here and a nice little cable right here. And by hunting around all the cables that seem to be attached to the alternator, by lifting this rubber boot, we can see a nice little corroded bolt here with a ring terminal being squashed down. And ultimately, looking out, we can follow the conduit around. One goes off over there, but ultimately one goes down here, under here, up through here, and to the positive terminal on the battery. This line here is our alternator to battery positive wire. That is the last three in the big three. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, you don't need to stop at the big three, especially if you're doing this for maintenance or prevention reasons, or you live in a bad environment. Go to the big five, the big seven. I'm sure there's other cables you can replace, but they are the three. That's where they are on this vehicle. Let's continue. Okay, so now we know where all these cables are located for the big three. The next thing we want to do is measure the cables. This cable is very expensive. We don't want to order any unnecessarily, so we need to measure the distance. And we also need to know this because we're going to be crimping our own cables in this video. We don't want a cable that sags too much. Maybe it might get caught in our belt here, but certainly we don't want one too short either. So do not use a measuring tape. Tip number one, get a piece of rope, or even if you have some wire, feed it through, take it round the corners you're going to go, take it on its exact route into its final destination. Don't forget to account that you might have a ring terminal on the end, which will work in your favor. It adds a little bit of length. But what I see a lot is people measuring these. They cut the cable, they crimp it, and it's too short because they don't account for cornering and things like that. There's not too much flex in these cables either. So get a bit of rope, route it around, and take an accurate measurement of all three connections. Alternator to battery positive, battery negative to chassis ground, and also the final one, the alternator / engine block ground to the chassis body as well. We need three measurements. Use a piece of rope or something like that. Okay, so this is what it will sort of look like. Move some components out the way, put it exactly where it's going to be. This is why you're going to get an accurate measurement in this case. So we've moved some hardware out the way. It's going to sort of snake under that. It's going to come up behind this plastic block. We'll see that later in the video. There's going to be an inline fuse here, so we're going to talk about that in a second. And then it's going to snake along this existing conduit right here, and then ultimately clamp onto our little ring terminal here. So you can see it's almost at the end around here. Okay, so what we needed for this connection is slightly less than 1 meter. We got around here on the cable, but without doing that, without snaking it around, look how long it is. It would go all the way here, and without snaking it around, you'd only think you'd need that much. And this is why a lot of people get caught out by making cables too short. So pro tip right there. So now you have all 3 cables measured here. Work out how they sell this. They might sell it by the foot, by the meter, and then you know exactly how much to order. Just order a little bit more than you need. Okay, so my alternator positive to battery positive is 90 centimeters, just less than 3 feet. The 2 black ones right here are very small, less than a foot each. So I know I just need 2 feet of black cable and also 3 feet of red cable. That should be plenty for this job, or just 1 meter of each, depending where you buy this from. Okay, so we're on the whiteboard just for a couple of minutes so I can talk through the wire sizing process. If you've never sized wire for a car electrical system, then stay tuned, because once you've gone through this, you're going to be able to size wire for pretty much anything on a vehicle, or maybe even potentially a house. So it is very invaluable information. So what size wire, what gauge wire do we use on our system? So the thicker the wire, the more current it can handle. If you run a high current through a small wire, then it's going to heat up like a glowworm and potentially cause a fire. So we want to size our wire depending on the load of our electrical circuit. Now the things on our circuit are going to be the alternator, that's going to be charging the battery, and then that's going to be supplying current to all our electrical devices. So it's very important we size the wire correctly. So to determine the correct wire gauge for our car's electrical system, you need to consider the expected current load, but also the length of the wire. The length of the wire is important because we suffer something called voltage drop. The longer the wire, the more voltage drop, and you have to increase the thickness to cater for voltage drop. So when you have a long wire, it needs to be thicker to cater for this. But luckily we can work all of this out. Now, what is the voltage in our circuit? So when the car is running, the alternator is charging the battery, and typically the voltage will go from around 12.6 to 13.8 to 14.6, give or take. This is a rough range. It depends on the year, make and model of the vehicle, but we're going to be looking at this figure right here. So this is the charging voltage in our system when the car is running. So this is the voltage we're going to be using, 14.6. Okay, the amps. Now how do we work out the amps? We have to look at the alternator of our car. What alternator we have on our car? Well, take the year, make and model of your car, put it into Google, check your service manual. It'll tell you what alternator you need for your car, or what alternator you have. By getting that model number and doing a quick Google, again, it's going to give you a model number, but also the max amps of your alternator. So let's run an example here. The alternator in my car is 150 amps. Okay, so we can work out the power, we can work out the wattage of this by multiplying these together. So let's go with 14.6, which is the charging voltage, multiplied by 150, and that will give us 1090 watts. And this is the maximum of our system. Nothing is 100% efficient, but if we sort of size our wire to here with a safety margin, we want to be safe, so a little cushion on top of there. This is sort of what we're aiming for. So how do we size the wire for this with a safety margin and calculate the length of the wire? Let's have a look. Okay, so something I touched on earlier, which is voltage drop. The longer the wire, the more voltage drop. So we need to know the length of our cable. Now, it's not very straightforward as you might think. You might think we have our alternator right here. We have our battery right here. Maybe our cable is 1 meter or 3 feet. Okay, so we know the length of our cable is 3 feet. Done. Let's push this into a calculator and work out the gauge of our wire. Well, it's not that simple, unfortunately, because in an electrical system, current flows in a complete loop from the power source, which is the alternator in this case, through the load, which is the battery right here, and then back to the source again. This is the full loop. So if you're calculating 3 feet in your calculations, Well, you're going to be halfway there because there's probably another 3 feet to get back to the power source. And this path includes both the positive and the ground right there. And there's the negative. Now, this will come back through means of the chassis in the car. So the car is one giant ground here. The battery is connected to the chassis here. And this will sort of find its way back through the grounding point in the engine block to the alternator, completing the electrical path here. So if you've measured from the alternator your battery, it's 3 feet or 1 meter, then chances are you're going to need 6 feet of cable in this case. Okay, let's just get my neighbor's sock here and get some sanitizer on there. Okay, so we know in our example here the voltage 14.6 volts, and the reason we use this is because we want to get the highest maximum possible number. If we work this out using 12 volts, and then when our car starts running, we're going to see an increase in voltage due to this. So this is why we're using 14.6. This is the highest voltage it's going to be in our system. In our example, we're using 150 amp maximum alternator output there, 150 amps. Plug yours into here. It doesn't really matter. It's just an example there. And then the length of our cable here is 12 feet. Or we can just say 2 meters. It doesn't really matter, whatever system you want to follow. The last thing is the cable. Now, will it be copper? Will it be aluminium? We're going to be using a copper conductor. We can take that as well. And then we can plug this into a wiring size calculator. There are many wire sizing calculators on the internet, but now you have all the figures you need to put this into an online calculator and get the appropriate wire gauge for a 150 amp alternator with a 12 volt system, but a charging voltage, and we know the length of our wire because we went in the car and measured it ourselves. And this includes the full electrical path, positive and negative, the full electrical loop. So that is everything we need to calculate our wire size. Let's plug it into a calculator and find out the gauge of wire we need. Okay, so working out the thickness or the gauge of the wire you need is pretty simple once you have all the figures like we got on the whiteboard. So I recommend Wirebarn. It's a very good website. It works for automotive applications. When doing this, make sure it is for automotive applications and not housing applications. And you'll get the voltages here. We're going to be using 13.8, which looks like a charging battery voltage here that we talked about before. We're going to put 150 amps here, and we know the length of our wire for the full electrical path is 6 feet. So if we go down to the bottom here and hit calculate, we can see all of the gauges that will work just fine with our requirements. So we can see here a 4 gauge wire will work just fine, a 2, a 1, a 0, and even a 00 as well. These are usually abbreviated like this. As you go to the zeros, you have 00, you'll have 2/0. That's just another way of writing this. That just means 2 zeros. You can have 3 zeros, which would be 3/0. So if you ever wondered about the confusion with that. So you can use any of these gauges here, but you have to ask yourself this question: what if you upgrade your alternator in the future? What if you want a bigger safety margin? You know, there's no reason you can't really choose a lower gauge wire. Why not have a 0 gauge wire? Well, a 0 gauge wire is going to be more expensive, but you're going to be sort of protected. You're future-proofing your car. Ultimately, the decision is yours. In the video, I'm going to be using a 0 gauge wire because I think most people are going to be using larger vehicles, and I want to give a realistic example. When you buy these kits, typically they'll come with a 0 gauge wire as well. That's what I'm using in the video. But the choice is really yours. This calculator will give you all the figures with safety margins, so you can rest assured you're not going to have any problems with shorts, overloads, heating, and things like that. So that's how a typical wire size calculator works, just like this one here. Okay, we're back outside. Let's talk about fusing real quick and why fusing is important. I've watched a few Big 3 videos and I was shocked to say almost no one mentioned fusing the positive line from the alternator to the battery. That is almost criminal. These things are so cheap, and it's so easy to protect your circuit and ultimately the car. At this point, this is a major cable in your car's electrical system. Now, what can happen here is, imagine you have your cable right here from alternator positive to battery positive. Maybe there's a short in here. Something goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. I've seen it firsthand before. Then there's a short in here. For example, say this metal contact point touches the engine block, which is a short to ground. What happens is the battery sees, oh look, there's a nice little shortcut here for ground. It goes through your positive connection right here, dumping potentially 500 plus amps through your cable, which is rated 345 amps. What happens if you get a 500 amp current through a 345 amp rated cable? It's going to start to glow like a giant neon glowworm and cause you so many problems, as well as safety concerns as well. For the cost of a $10 fuse like this one here, it's a no-brainer. You already have the crimping tools, you already have everything else. Please install a fuse on your positive line from the alternator to the battery. Okay, that's rant over. So let's talk about some fuse options real quick to do with fusible links and also inline fuses like this one here. This is an ANL fuse with an ANL fuse holder. So in the holder, I can just take the lid off here and we can replace this fuse with a different rating at any time, or if it blows, we can unbolt that and put it back in. It has the bolts for our ring terminals here, so we can pop that straight on, and it supports our 0 AWG wire here, so everything is going to look great with this. But let's talk about fusible links. Now, a fusible link is something where you have a smaller piece of wire to complete a circuit of perhaps a lower gauge wire. So for instance, this wire here is 0 AWG. It goes from here, 0 AWG, but just before it gets to the battery, there's a thinner piece of wire, maybe 6 AWG, maybe 8 or something like that. And that thinner piece of wire completing the circuit acts as a fuse. So if too much current goes through here, the smaller piece of wire right here, right up against the battery, will blow, it'll melt away, it'll dissolve and disappear, ultimately protecting your wiring, because that is the job of a fuse, to protect the wiring. So what's under this plastic block right here? Okay, so removing this little plastic tab here, if you've ever wondered what's under here, well, they are fusible links right there. So you can see the gauge of the wire coming in is ultimately quite thick, and then you can see a little tiny bit of wire. It's almost like a micro fusible link, or really a fuse in itself. It's hard to say which one it is, but that is the principle here. You see all these different gauge wires coming in. You can see a very small piece of wire here, just like the internal workings of a fuse. Ultimately, it goes to your positive terminal right here. So you could say a fusible link is very much like the internal of a fuse, except fusible links are a little bit longer. But for using 0 WAG wire like this one here, fusible link is very hard or almost impossible to find. It seems they go a lot shorter. So this is the reason I'm using an ANL fuse right here. You can use a fusible link if you want to. Some people do with a higher gauge wire, but I can't seem to find that product anywhere for this wire. And I think this is a much better solution. Okay, so the next question you may have is, what rating fuse do I put in here? What size fuse do I use? I have no idea. What's going on with all these amps and everything like that? Well, we talked about wire sizing earlier right here, so you know everything to do with that now. If you want to learn more in detail about fuse sizing, I'll link a video in the description below. You can check it out, where we cover the topic of a car heater and everything in between, but I will cover it briefly here. Now, when you pick a fuse, you want to protect the circuit, so that's the wiring in the circuit right here. This wire right here from the manufacturer, doesn't matter what the internet says, they don't make the wiring. The manufacturer states that their cable is rated for 345 amps. So we need a fuse to protect this wiring right here. Now, if a 320 amp fuse exists, it could work, but I think a 300 amp fuse will be fine. It gives us a nice little safety margin. It's going to be no problem at all. So why do you have a 100 amp fuse in here? Well, I had a 100 amp fuse lying around. I didn't have a 300 amp fuse. Should I buy a 300 amp fuse? Should I save some money? Well, what's the output of your alternator, and what do you need to protect here? So we need to protect our circuit in case there's a short, the battery dumps a huge amount of current and it ends up looking like a glowworm. Now, whether you have a 200 amp fuse, a 300 amp fuse, a 100 amp fuse, they're all gonna blow. So our short is protected with the fuse this way. Now, we don't want accidental tripping of the fuse from the alternator. How powerful is your alternator? How much current? How many watts? Everything like that. Now, this is a project car. I'm not going to realistically use this in a tiny alternator like this one. This is a 85 amp alternator. That is the maximum current of this alternator, 85 amps. So if the alternator has spikes, surges, or anything like that, it's not going to trip our circuit, trip our fuse, destroy our nice $10 fuse. If there's a problem in that regard, we've added a nice safety margin of 15 amps above the maximum rated output. So a 100 amp fuse would work perfectly fine. Same with a 200 amp fuse. It's not going to trip it, and we're still protected this way. So as long as your fuse is above the maximum output of your alternator with a safety margin, and it's certainly less than maybe 500 amps or something like that to protect a short, you should be fine. But really, you should size the fuse to protect the circuit. So ideally, maybe a 250, 300 amp fuse would work fine. But in this instance, with this crappy alternator, a 100 amp fuse is going to work as well. I hope that's busted a lot of myths and confusion with sizing a fuse for circuits. Okay, so whichever fusing option you've decided on, this is going to affect how we crimp our wires. Obviously, we've ordered the correct amount of cable already, but we need to cater for this. And also, we don't want to put these everywhere. Maybe we have connections that don't have ring terminals. So let's just investigate real quick. Now, our negative terminal here has a ring terminal at the back here, but it doesn't have a ring terminal right here. Well, it kind of does, but if we put this on the other end, it's not going to work out for us. So we may need a special connector to hook that up, and we might not need this at all. We can just feed the conductor into here and crimp it down with a special connector. So we may need to order something for that one. Coming over on the positive side here, I've removed some of this hardware so we can see how we can get in here. Now, there's lots of different options for this we can do, but removing some of this stuff here, we can see there's a normal ring terminal sitting right here. I don't see any problem in just adding to that. I think that's going to work great. So we're going to have a ring terminal there. Coming over on the alternator, lifting this cap up, I think we can probably add in another ring terminal under this boot here. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And coming over here, I don't see a problem in using 2 ring terminals here. So it looks like 3 of our 4 endpoints for our ground points here will have ring terminals, and our positive will have ring terminals as well. Not forgetting the fuse, and the fuse will be mounted as close to the battery as possible. Now, there's going to be a lot of things in the way here, but we need to make sure this is as close to the battery, because this is going to protect as much cable as we can. If we put the fuse right next to the alternator, it's only going to protect this part of the wiring. All of this can glow up like a glowworm, no problem. So we need to put this as close to the battery as possible, and we need to crimp our cables to allow for this as well. So I'm going to probably have this sitting just underneath this red block or something like that. But bear in mind, things heat up, things rub on things, so you know, put it in a very safe place. You might need to mount it somewhere. There's some mounting holes, and cater for this. You know, actually put your wire in there, feed it in, see if it looks good, and then start crimping afterwards. So if you want to crimp your own cables at home nice and professionally with all the tools, then I've linked a separate video in the video description below so you can check it out. I just didn't want this video to get too long. Okay, back to it. Okay, so I have my cables somewhat all prepared now. We have our chassis ground to the engine block. We have our battery negative terminal here. I'm just waiting on a part to hook that up. It's not going to use a standard ring connector there. So that's our battery negative to chassis ground. And our alternator positive to battery positive with inline fuse all measured up and ready to install. So let's start with this one right here. So before we start removing and messing with any electrical work, remove the negative terminal on your battery to sever the connection so we're not going to get any shorts or nasty surprises. Now, something very important when bolting these to chassis ground, so on the body of your car, you need to make sure there's no rust, debris, corrosion, paint, or anything in the way of making a good electrical connection. So with that in mind, we will need something like this on a drill just to remove all of that stuff out the way so we can make a very good contact. So coming down here, this is the one we're going to do right now. So this one doesn't look too bad. It's quite accessible. You can see we have the paint on the body of the car there. We're gonna have to remove that. We cannot get a good contact through the paint of the body of the car. So we're going to unbolt this. We're going to unbolt this one on this end here and clean up both connections. Even if there's no paint on this connection, we're going to clean it anyway. There might be some rust, corrosion, debris or anything like that. So with the old one removed here, I'm going to clean up these connections here. You can see there's a little bit of corrosion, rust, something under there. I'm just going to polish it up with the drill and get it nice and clean. And the same applies for anything in the car where you're mounting it to, whether you're tapping a new hole, using an existing one somewhere else, and also the terminals on the engine block ground point itself. So clean everything up. Now, if you think your existing grounding point is too small, too bad, too rusted, it's absolutely no problem using something else. Just make sure there's not a rubber insulator separating it from getting a ground. Test with a multimeter if you have to. There's no problem grounding it here at all. You may need to use different sized washers, different sized bolts or anything like that to get a good connection. If you do use these materials, make sure they're not going to corrode instantly. They're not cheap ones from China or anything like that. I think this is more of an art form really. It depends what year, make and model of car you have, but just use some common sense. Make sure you get a nice big grounding point, there's no paint in the way, and everything else is good. Okay, so that's our first cable installed right there. It is recommended you use star lock washers to bolt these in, especially where the grounding points are concerned, because they bite into the metal. They give a good solid connection. And if you do off-roading or your vehicle goes in conditions where there's a lot of vibrations, then it's not going to come undone. However, if you don't have star lock washers, not many people do, I recommend semi-permanent Loctite. It's the removable Loctite, the blue one right here. Thread locker. We use this on suspension components. That's gonna hold just fine, to be honest. So don't worry about star lock washers if you just have standard ones like these here. The last thing we're gonna do here is to clean up our connections. Because we used a drill on some of the body work here, we don't want to introduce rust or anything like that, so we just want to protect it. You can use some paint, some primer, but just a nice little dollop of lacquer or clear coat or something, it's gonna work great with that. And that'll do it. Might need to wipe it off there a little bit. Okay, the next one we're going to install is our alternator positive to battery positive with our inline fuse. Let's go. Okay, so on the back of the alternator, on this one anyway, I have a 13mm bolt there. I'm going to undo that and have a look at the condition here. Okay, so the condition of our existing connections here is actually quite shocking. This is going to introduce resistance. It's going to make our alternator work harder and lead to premature alternator failure. So I'm going to clean these up. That looks a little better now. Okay, so everything here is nice and clean here. I've put it back where it goes. What we're going to do is mount this on sort of additionally onto the bolt like that. Hopefully there's enough room for the nut to go on. I think there will be. And then we're going to try and squeeze this boot over everything. And then we won't need to buy a new boot or anything like that. But that's the plan anyway with this one. So you may be asking yourself, well, why are you leaving that connection in and adding this one to it? We removed this one, we threw it away and put a new one in. Why didn't we run two there? Well, with the positive alternator to the positive battery, you can see the existing cable runs inside all this trunking. It gets tied to all these various zip ties and also splits off in multiple directions. Removing this would actually be very difficult and I just don't really see the point. So what we're doing here, we're adding an additional wire here, which would mean the existing one would run in parallel to our new one right here. And if you're not sure what that means, Imagine a stream of water. The water goes down the hill, and at the bottom of the hill there's two pipes, like a sewer system. There's a large one right here, a large tunnel, and a smaller tunnel right here. Now more of the water is going to go into the larger tunnel, just like this wire is going to handle more current. The smaller wire will get some as well, so this one will also still be working, but the majority of the current, the majority of the action is actually going to run through our new wire. So there's absolutely no problem in running this in parallel with the existing harness right here. And it's going to make your life so much easier as well. So if you have a connection like this and you want to tidy it up a bit, maybe you can't fit some vacuum sleeving over the end because it's a bit knobbly, you don't have enough space, then I recommend some Tesla tape. This is used widely in electrical connections in vehicles. I think the Tesla cars use it. You pretty much just put it on an electrical table, it'll stay there, it'll protect it from temperatures and elements. It's a really good tape. I'll link it below, you can check it out, but something like this would work absolutely great rather than something like electrical tape. Okay, so I managed to get the existing boot around both wires there, the new and the existing one, so it's going to try and protect it, although that didn't seem to work in reality because I had to clean it up. It was very oxidized and corroded. So I've put them together here. There's a little bit of a space there, so I'm going to pop in a copper washer to keep our conductivity theme there and also get a good sandwiched connection between the two, and then I'm going to pop them back onto our little stud there and bolt it up to the alternator. So because the condition underneath our alternator boot right here was pretty bad, we've just spent a lot of time removing all that oxidation and rust. I'm going to apply some dielectric grease on the connections. Now with dielectric grease, make sure you get the connection first. The connection is secure, and then put the dielectric grease on the outside. If you want to learn all about dielectric grease, I've made a dedicated video. I'll link it in the description below. Now for any wiring, especially wiring near moving components, temperatures, high temperatures from the exhaust manifold or the engine for that matter, we should use some kind of trunking like this to protect the wire from the elements. Otherwise we're going to get a short, and then we're going to be really glad we put a fuse right here. So trunking, it doesn't really matter which you choose. This is kind of like a standard trunking. It's quite cheap, easy to obtain. Just make sure the inside diameter is bigger than the conductor and the insulator together, otherwise you're going to be in a bit of a pickle. Failing that, you can use some braiding. It looks like something from a computer power supply. This will equally work. This one looks a bit nicer, it's more expensive. This one's cheaper, and you know, the decision is yours. If you decide to take the braiding route here and you cut it, just make sure you get a lighter and burn all of the end, otherwise it's going to fray until you're going to need to replace it. So very important tip there. Just like when cutting clothing, nylon or anything like that, the same thing applies, and that will seal everything in, and it's not going to slowly peel away over time. If you're using standard trunking or conduit like this one, the easiest way to apply it is to lean it back like this, and then you can just push it on like that. Very easy, otherwise it gets a little fiddly. Alright, so it's looking pretty professional already. We're going to position our fuse in the limited space we have and see if we can connect everything else up. So it looks like now the conduit's in, everything is snaked up, we got our little fuse here, and now this seems to be too long. You know, things like this happen all the time, but it's better to have it too long than too short. You know, it is what it is. I'm just going to shorten this one a little bit, and when we connect this onto the battery, you can see the existing one has a little bend there in our loop connector here, so I'm going to replicate that in here, and then it can hopefully snake behind our little box. But all cars and trucks are going to be different, but it is more of an art form in getting these things, and I am not artistic, but at least it's going to work, and we're not going to go up in flames or have a glow snake under the hood. So one thing I'll mention, if you're struggling to try and get your positive terminal on the battery here, or even the negative for that matter, you can get something like this, which will give you multiple connections for whatever you want to hook up. These are pretty cool because they're quick release, so you don't need to bother with bolts here, like these 10mm bolts here. You can sort of quick release, just like a bicycle seat, and they're pretty good. So the main terminal would go through here, so that's the wire that will get clamped down, and then you can put kind of O-rings on the outer two, or even those if they're small enough. So I'll link these below, you can check them out if you need to use them. Okay, so I've put a bit of a bend in this terminal here, so we can pretty much just slot it on top of the existing one. That's gonna go there. And then that is just gonna go on top of everything. Okay, so this is all wired in now. It's all nice and solid with our existing system. You might have to get a little bit creative. It just really does matter. So now we have a tiny bit of wire here, and we have our fuse, and then everything beyond that is protected by our fuse right here. Okay, so the positive line is in now. We just need to zip tie it down. If you live in a hot environment, now I used to live in Las Vegas for 10 years, and these zip ties would crack and break in about 2 years. Absolutely crazy. But these metal zip ties exist right in the middle here. They're actually really good. So I do recommend these if you live in that kind of environment, and they're never gonna break either. Okay, so everything's zip tied down. It's really nice and tidy. Cable management is very important. You don't want to put this near anything vibrating, moving, hot, or anything like that. Following an existing line is a good way to go, because you know the manufacturers determine that's a good route for electrical components. We have our fuse there. I've put a zip tie around the holder just for safety. It has a little bit of a loose fit. Otherwise, everything's done, bolted on, and that is our alternator positive to our battery positive. Okay, and our last and final one is very similar to the first one here. It's right here, the battery negative to the chassis ground right there. We're just going to unbolt this like we did before, clean it up and bolt it on. Okay, so the new terminal's finally arrived in the mail. It pretty much goes on the negative post, and then we can put our standard loop terminals on here. So now we know what they look like. This is what we've sort of put together here for that last cable of the big three. I think I like this configuration a little better. I'm not really too much of a fan of getting a wire and squishing it down here, but you know, whatever works for you. But yeah, this is the last one. And with that, our third and final cable of the big three is now complete. So that's the big three complete. Now we have our alternator positive all the way through our nice conduit into our fuse here, our inline fuse into the battery positive. We have battery negative here to our chassis ground, and also the alternator negative routed through the grounding of our engine block into the chassis there. They are the big three. And if you're doing this for corrosion reasons, or you want to put less work on your electrical system in general, then why stop at 3? Do 5, do 7. Whatever you think is corroded or needs replacing, then go ahead and do it. You know exactly how to do it with wire sizing and everything in between, learning how to do this safely and properly. Why trust a random garage with someone working at a very low wage to do this for you? You have no idea how they're going to do it, what they're going to do, but by watching this video you can see the tips, procedures, and the proper way of doing your own big three installation yourself at home and saving a ton of money in the process. If you like the video, like and subscribe. We'll be making more videos like this very soon, and exciting new plans for our alternator in this car, which is why we're doing the big three in the first place. So stay tuned for that, and take care guys. Thank you for watching. I just want to say a real quick message to our viewers. I made this channel a few years ago, and its primary aim was to give you the skills, but more importantly the confidence, in order to tackle pretty much any DIY job you may have. In the process, we've saved our viewers thousands of dollars or pounds or euros, whichever currency you want to use. I've put multiple hours of time into making videos each and every week, which I somehow juggle between family and a full-time job. If any of our videos on our channel helped you, please support our channel by clicking the thanks button underneath any video on this channel. You can choose how much you wish to donate. It's going to go right back into the channel towards videos, tools, and everything else. So thank you very much for that. When you make a donation towards the channel, you can put an optional message, and your message will be highlighted along all the comments for everybody to see. The bigger the donation, the bigger the highlight, so everybody can see how awesome you are.